Hello again. We are going to pick up right after the JFK presidency, right at the end of it, and we're going to transition into the next part of the 60s. Um, Really, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be building off of what had happened um, in foreign affairs in the Cold War, and we're going to bring that into our domestic effects today, and then expand back out at the end into one of the most well-known pieces of the Cold War, and that's the Vietnam War. So really to understand that, we need to understand where we just came off of. We need to understand the Kennedy administration's really major success towards the end. We have the Soviet Union starting to build up nuclear missile silos in Cuba. We send our U-2 plane over and it captures a glimpse of what is happening in Cuba. And the big question is number one, why? The reason why goes all the way back to the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was planned during the Eisenhower administration, but Kennedy actually gave the order to carry it out. They needed airstrikes, and he didn't follow through on that, held back on it, and ultimately this coup attempt failed. Castro was absolutely furious, and so he started to align himself with our number one enemy. Our number one enemy is definitely going to be the Soviet Union, and so the Soviet Union helps build up these missiles. Now, if you watched the Armageddon letters already, you would have already seen that kind of viewpoint from Khrushchev of trying to level the playing field to balance out the nukes that the United States has in Turkey pointed at Moscow to hopefully come to an agreement, come to a bargaining table. But ultimately, JFK is going to handle the Cuban Missile Crisis in the way of not invading Cuba, not attacking the Soviet Union or Cuba. What he's going to do is he's going to quarantine Cuba. I'm not going to use the term blockade because blockade is technically a military action, and so he's trying to play kind of a dance around the wording here. But in all intents and purposes, it's a blockade. The Soviets come close and close and closer to that line, and then they turn around and everything kind of backs off. We get very, very close to nuclear annihilation over this 13-day period when this whole thing began. Ultimately, there are some big takeaways from this, though. Number one, we have a hotline installed between the Soviet Union and the United States, a way of direct communication to try to solve these issues in the future, which ultimately gets this big stepping back in the disarmament of the nuclear arms race a little bit, and we take a step back with us in the Soviet Union, and we pull our nukes out of Turkey, they pull their nukes out of Cuba, and we also agree to never try to invade Cuba. And that's the foreign affairs piece where there's going to be a little bit of cooling down of us directly between us and the Soviet Union. So that is going to separate itself a little bit. That's going to be a positive effect. We almost come to a really, really big mistake, but we're able to pump the brakes on that. The domestic effect is going to be this is going to really glorify the Kennedy administration. It's going to be seen as this massive, massive success, and as a result of that massive success, he's going to be extremely popular. But unfortunately, later in 1963, Kennedy is going to be assassinated, and that's where we're going to pick up today. So there's that foreign affairs effect. It's going to help, but then there's also a big impact on the domestic front about what ripple effects this will actually cause. Again, just we're always bringing in these objectives, really always harping back to these key points, right? We're talking about social change that's really going to happen, and a big piece of that is going to be Kennedy's death. And it's not so much that Kennedy got so many things done, but I always say this and it usually shocks students, but one of the most impactful things that Kennedy did in this country, besides the Cuban Missile Crisis, was his death. The country is going to do so many things in memory of him and put things through. It's not so much the things that he actually did during his term, but things that he wanted to do. But with his assassination, he's going to become kind of like a martyr and almost like a saint in American political history. Whitewash all any bad things that he had going on for him or that happened, and things are going to be done in memory of him. We're going to talk about changes or any continuities in Cold War policies and where we're going to see the Cold War continue. The civil rights movement is going to be deeply affected after Kennedy's death. There's going to be massive change during the following administration. We will also be talking about the war in Vietnam. So there are various military and diplomatic issues, and we'll see that continuity and change over time. We will also see the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is a big marquee moment. So we'll be talking about that. I'll give you some great resources to get even more depth. And then how different people really started to pull for this call for civil rights. There's going to be a lot of questioning of the government, and the growth of the government is going to reach its pinnacle in 1968. And then there's going to be a sharp movement to decrease the size and power of the government. So this is going to keep continuing since FDR, and then there is going to be a change. Lastly, we have some of these bigger pictures of how is the government going to respond to these changes, and also how there's going to be opposition on the home front to a lot of things that are going on, and there's going to be a questioning of the federal government, and kind of that Beats movement is going to pick up into the hippie and the counterculture movement. There's going to be questioning the size and the scope of the federal government. And lastly, how is this shaping our country's identity? We're seeing so many different changes, but we can build off the past decades. We can see the Truman administration to the Eisenhower administration to JFK to LBJ. Does he keep kind of the stride that JFK was going with, or is he going to try to switch up? We'll see how that goes today. So our key focus, we're going to start to sum up all of those little objectives that we looked at, to sum up the number one question. How much or to what degree was LBJ's Great Society a continuation of or a break from JFK's New we're talking domestically here, remember? This is our number one focus, going to be domestic, right? We're going to compare the foreign affairs issue, which is totally different, but we're going to start domestically first. We'll start in two realms. Now, when we're talking about the Great Society, it's a term that a lot of students I find often don't grab the full scope. We are talking like on the scale of the New Deal. There are going to be comparisons, contradictions between the two. But it was actually on the test not that long ago, the same comparison. It was SAQ number 4. So it was that choice you get in the SAQ section between 3 or 4. One is from periods 1 through 5. One is from periods 6 through 9. This was the choice from periods 6 through 9. It asked you to identify a similarity between the Great Society and FDR's New Deal, a difference between them, and then also an effect of one of them. So that's the kind of format you can see here. Now that means we're not going to see it maybe in the 2020 exam. It could appear in the future on the SAQ section or in some other way. You could get a different style of question about this topic, but that also doesn't mean that we're not going to see it in the multiple choice or the LAQ. It could pop up and be very helpful, or in the DBQ it could be very helpful. So it's a big term to latch onto. It's explicitly stated in the curriculum, so we're gonna turn a little special attention to this subject. Let us continue. These are the words from LBJ giving one of his, well, rather his first speech in the Senate after Kennedy's assassination. And that's going to kind of be the focus, continuing from this tragedy. So on November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, JFK goes down to visit for a speech, and he is going to be assassinated. And due to our succession laws, when the president is no longer able to serve, the vice president then takes over. So JFK is assassinated, and LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, then becomes president. You'll also note kind of in this photo, standing next to him, you'll see here, this is JFK's wife right here. This is taken on Air Force One, the president's private plane, just hours after Kennedy is actually confirmed dead at the hospital and Johnson is sworn in. So from the immediate death of JFK, we swear in President Johnson, and this becomes the Johnson administration. Now he will serve till the end of Kennedy's term, which would end in 1964, would be the next election, and then we'll see if Johnson decides to run again. LBJ actually has a really, really good record when we're talking as a politician. And so he was sort of added to Kennedy's ticket to balance out Kennedy from seeming too young and inexperienced, kind of in the same way that Joe Biden was added to Obama's ticket in 2008 and 2012. LBJ's big focus was that he would really promise to continue Kennedy's ideas and his liberal change agenda. And so a lot of the things that are going to be pushed forward are going to be in memory of Kennedy. he is actually going to do way more than JFK ever could when we're talking economic change, inequality, so trying to eradicate sections of poverty, and then also racial equality. LBJ did way, way more than Kennedy ever did. And he is going to try to push through all of this different form of legislation, very, very liberal, but it's going to be very wide sweeping. It's going to be a lot of legislation, a lot of control, executive control as well. And so this will actually pass the scope of even what the New Deal was passing through. So this is a whole new level. This is the height of government power and control as we've seen it. So this is going to be very, very important for us. So if we're tracking continuity and change over time of the size and power and role of government, we are continuing that upward trend, and this is going to be a big spike again. So this is one of the last photos we have of Kennedy. He was traveling in a motorcade in a car in the back seat with his wife next to him, and the governor of Texas and their wife in front of them in this open kind of top-down car. And what happens is he will be assassinated by a sniper. There is one actual recording of what was going on at this time and how this whole thing unfolded. There was a man with the last name of Zapruder. It was just a home video camera recording what's going on. You can actually see this footage elsewhere. It's all on the internet. It wasn't released to the public right away, but was later declassified. And there are many, of course, conspiracy theories when people are shocked by events so they can't explain what's happening. But America will be completely shaken to the core by the events that take place. It's going to take place here on Elm Street in Dallas. Up at the top here, you'll see a circle. Lee Harvey Oswald is the name of the shooter who is going to hit Kennedy. He's going to hit him once in the back of the neck through his throat. And if you watch the film, you'll see him grab his throat, and then the second one will hit him in the head. It will not instantly kill him, but he will be pronounced dead actually at the hospital. This dot here in the bottom left is the perspective from where the recording is actually taken. So you don't really get to see that from the building. There isn't a recording of that. The Texas School Book Depository, which is kind of like the storage house for the school department. And this kind of event is just going to trip all around the country, and America will be absolutely shook into the core, especially after a very, very successful event in handling the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, there'll be a lot of different theories about what happened. Some people feel that this was set up or this couldn't have happened. There had to be multiple shooters because there's an exit wound from Kennedy and an entrance wound into Connally, who was the governor of Texas at the time, that goes through his shoulder and hand. But these cars' seats were not perfectly even. And the way that he was set up, sitting in the front seat, is going to allow for the bullet to go through Kennedy, through the back of Connally, and into his hand. So there are bullet wounds on both gentlemen. Ultimately, Kennedy becomes kind of like this martyr figure, and the whole country is mourning. This picture on the right, you see Jackie Kennedy with the veil over her face, his brother Robert, and their young son, Jackie and John Kennedy, that is, young son here saluting her father as they go by. And this image is just, it's heartbreaking to the American public. This young couple, and just taken too soon in their eyes. Now, one thing that I always like to bring up, and this is always funny, but there's a lot of comparisons. So maybe the Illuminati involved. Some people say a lot of comparisons between Lincoln and Kennedy. And when you look at it, it kind of gets kind of weird. So, for example, Kennedy was a congressman before he was president. He was elected to Congress in 1946. Lincoln was elected in 1846. And Lincoln was elected president in 1860, while Kennedy in 1960. Weird coincidence, I know, but there's more. They were both directly concerned with the civil rights movement and a lot of social change in that regard. Lincoln was shot in the head in front of his wife on a Friday. Kennedy was also shot in the head in front of his wife on a Friday. Weird coincidences, perhaps, but wait, there's more. Lincoln was shot in the Ford Theater. That is where John Wilkes Booth, the assassination happened. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln, which is a type of Ford. You have the assassins. Both assassins have 3 names, so John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, and both of them have 15 letters. Seems a little bit too good, too weird to be true. Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and then fled to a warehouse, which was a barn. And Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse, school book depository, and then fled, and he actually hid in a theater where he was captured in Dallas. Both Booth and Oswald were actually killed before actually being brought to trial to confess. Both of these men are believed to be part of a greater and larger conspiracy cover-up theory. And lastly, this one, it's even weirder. This is one of the weirdest ones to me. Both Lincoln and Kennedy's successors, vice presidents who took over, his last names were Johnson, Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson. And both of them were born 100 years apart. Weird. I don't know. Illuminati throwing up the triangle seems a little bit too fishy to me. Ultimately, there's been a bunch of different conspiracy theories that you can check out for your own amusement. None of them really have much value whatsoever. They're for the most part very, very speculative. But this and the moon landing are probably 2 of the biggest conspiracy theories. But you also think about the time that it's coming in. It's this time of massive government questioning, lack of trust of government, and feeling that the government is out to manipulate and control you. So there's a lot of questioning the truth. How can we trust this information source back and forth? There's a lot of different things you can look at. Some people claim that his that Oswald did carry out the assassination, but he was mentally impaired because of an addiction to Coca-Cola and the chemicals inside of it. A mob boss did it. That one of the Watergate burglars from the Nixon administration eventually did it. That Johnson helped organize it. There are people that said that there were multiple shooters, or that there's no way that this could be done. Other people felt that there were these different specific groups that were out to get him, that the Secret Service did it, that somebody, this angry Texas oilman who felt cheated by some of the legislation that was being screwed over, did it, that somebody from Cuba did it, that somebody from the Soviet Union did it, that the military did. Everybody had this insider information that they actually knew who the real killer was. But no one really knows. There's so much misinformation. There's no closure on these events that it really causes Americans to really grasp for straws. Ultimately, there are a lot of photos of this time period and videos, but it's really hard because you don't just get to see the good, you get to see the painful as well. You see Jackie Kennedy just heartbroken, trying to hold strong while Johnson is sworn in. And them trying to comfort her, but as best you can, while this oath is taking 2 hours after her husband is confirmed. But this change happens, and America must, as Johnson says, let us continue. This is actually the speech, the quick little speech that he gives when he's actually inaugurated before this other big speech from Congress. But America is really trying to wade through these unprecedented waters. It hasn't happened. An assassination hasn't happened really in quite some time. Now, we're going to go into the Great Society. What is the culture like? What are the focus and the values? So we need to understand who our president is first. JFK is from Texas. He used to actually be a teacher, and then eventually, in the later part of the 1930s, he's elected to the House of Representatives. He later then serves in World War II. When he comes back, he serves in the Senate. He was the Senate minority and majority leader for the Democrats, and then eventually becomes the vice president to Kennedy. So he was a Democrat from the South, from Texas, and he plays a lot of big roles in politics. So he has a really long political career, really long. Since the 30s, served in World War II, a lot of high-ranking positions in the Senate, rather. So he is no schlup when it comes to actually political. There was really three events that we're going to talk about when we're hitting the Johnson administration. These are three of them, but we're probably going to talk about them in reverse order. So one of them is the civil rights movement, for sure. Really, the grounds that are made during the Johnson administration are the biggest since the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after the Civil War. The Vietnam War is another big one that really sticks out about the Johnson administration. Sometimes it's called Johnson's War because of the amount of troops and involvement that's sent in there, but there's a lot of backlash to it. And then the one that we're really going to talk about is the Great Society. Is this domestic reform plan that's really going to be pushed through? So we're going to get at it bit by bit as we go through the Great Society. But before he can actually enact anything, right? Kennedy is killed at the very end of 1963. 1964 is an election year. Johnson was not planning on running. There were already Republicans that were planning to run against Johnson. And there were other candidates like the segregationist George Wallace. We're going to hear a lot about him when we're talking about the civil rights movement. But really put that into perspective. Johnson was expecting to be a vice president candidate in 1964. He wasn't thinking about running the campaign. He was thinking about being the candidate for the Democratic Party. But with Kennedy's death in November of 1963, 1964 rolls around real quick, 1 year before the election, and you're just starting your campaign. That's pretty late. So what's going to happen is he's going to be thrust into the limelight. The Republicans have already been kind of backing up behind a super conservative Republican, a man by the name of Barry Goldwater. He is going to be heavy anti-liberal welfare. He is going to be he wants a really strong foreign policy. He is going to be really pushing against what Kennedy and LBJ were really standing on. He saw that the Kennedy administration was extremely weak. We had so many failures. We did have one success recently, but it should have never gotten to that. And you're going to have other people that are running more so on just the domestic realm. A man by the name of George Wallace, who is a governor in the South. He's a great example of a Dixiecrat. These were Democrats that were not really in line with Truman after World War II, where Truman was moving on this kind of desegregation route and social reform changes. And they were like the hardcore old Southern Democrats. They are going to run on kind of a resegregation platform after schools are desegregated. That is re segregated. They are really pushing against kind of this opposition to civil rights. So they are going to drive a wedge in the Democratic Party going forward. So we've got all these different pieces moving together. What's going to happen? Actually, LBJ wins, and he wins in an absolute landslide. It's one of the larger victories in the 1900s. And one of the top ones of all time because of that memory of Kennedy, kind of continuing that Kennedy memory. Democrats take control of Congress as well for the first time in over 25 years. So this takes us literally all the way back to the FDR administration. So there's some comparisons there. But remember what this means. If Congress has a unified front as well as the executive branch, that means a lot of legislation can go through. So the Republicans no longer control Congress. The Democrats have control of the executive branch with Johnson, who is building off of that kind of Kennedy allure, and they're going to use that to sweep these elections and take back control of Congress. So this means a lot of legislation go through. But first, we're going to take a look at this electoral map. Notice there are no other third parties getting votes for the Electoral College, but look at all that blue. There is only a small chunk of states that vote red. Arizona, where Goldwater is from, and then that deep, deep south right there that he has control over. But other than that, the rest is blue. The whole thing is blue. So Johnson wins over 90% of the Electoral College votes. Now, even though he loses, Goldwater is very important. He is going to really start this wave of the new Republican Party and kind of what that means. So Eisenhower wasn't really a hardcore Republican. He domestically was very, very liberal. But economically he was a little bit fiscally conservative, so he was kind of like a transitional phase. This is going to be kind of the model of what the new Republican Party is going to be like. It's finally a transition and a reorganization from the Republican Party of the 1920s or the Gilded Age, where there really hasn't been much success or continuity, like the Democrats have had under kind of following that model of FDR. It's going to be hardcore conservatism. It's not like compromising to try to be a moderate. It's being on this kind of political crusade of small government, right? Finding this way to use government in the best way possible, the least government possible. There's going to be a lot of major support that's coming up. One major senator by the name of Ronald Reagan in the 60s is going to start to really gain that support. He used to be a Democrat, but he begins to actually flip after Goldwater really puts on this big speech and big movement. And there's a new conservative sort of movement responding to a lot of the liberal change that's going on. You're going to see this group of Democrats that are really forming and changing themselves all throughout the 30s and the 40s and into the 50s. And then they're going to change a little bit again, where the youth are going to take over, and we're going to see like far left, like hippies and counterculture movement, civil rights movement. And then there's going to be a reaction to that movement, which is going to be the new right. So I know it's a lot right now, but just understand that there is political formation and the values are starting to change. So if you want to almost think of it like a different party system, there's going to be a new left and a new right in the 60s and 70s moving forward, and kind of what these people stand for and what their values are. So there's political reorganization based on a lot of these domestic changes that are happening. This is going to kind of get a little bit of an up and up in the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, with Richard Nixon being elected. There's going to be the Watergate scandal, which we'll talk about in a future video or a future lesson. But it's really going to hit full stride with the end of period 8 going into period 9, which is 1980, which is the election of Ronald Reagan. And so Reagan is going to become this big modern figure of what a lot of modern Republicans strive to be connected to. Now, in 2016 and beyond, it's kind of changed a little bit. There's kind of the Trump Republican, but for really the past 20 to 40 years, Reagan has been kind of that model for the Republican Party. Now, the Great Society is really, really wide sweeping. It's wide reaching. And you can't really talk about social change without the Great Society. I kind of compare it to like the New Deal of the 1960s, how over a period of time it was so wide-reaching and so expansive that it had a massive impact on that decade of the 1930s. It will do the same thing for the 1960s. Now, we have to figure out what we want to do. What are our goals? What is our focus during this time period? And number one, we can look at fixing a couple major issues. Number one is a reduction of poverty, and he will call this sometimes his war on poverty, trying to eradicate it drastically from our country. We're also going to see this improvement in the environment, which is something we haven't really seen as well, but trying to create a great society to live in, the greatest society, fixing inequality of wealth, fixing our dealing with the environment, improving education, especially. The civil rights movement is going to be the most famous part of the Great Society. And really, when you look at this map, this thought web, you can see all the different ways and areas that it hits. So this is what makes it a little bit more difficult sometimes to really grasp what's going on. But look at the years that this is happening. This all happens from 1964 up to 1968. It is a very short period of time where there is massive, wide sweeping changes that are really enacted by the Great Society. So it really casts a wide net, and we'll be able to see how impactful it really is. Ultimately, LBJ gets a lot of things done, and we can really see kind of at the beginning. The first thing that he does is he really pushes through two bills, and they're sometimes called Kennedy bills because they're really done in memory of what the new frontier wanted to accomplish, what Kennedy wanted to accomplish, but never actually could during his term. There's a massive reduction in income taxes so that people had more money to spend, hopefully creating new jobs, re-stimulating the economy. And then the other big thing that's really passed is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Segregation in all public facilities was illegal, right? That's not just schools, as Brown versus Board of Education says, but all forms of segregation are illegal. It also helps protect voting rights of African Americans, although there aren't explicit, tangible things to really weed out all of the problems. This really is the biggest advancement for civil rights or for race relations since 15th Amendment, right? So it's a really, really big term. You probably shouldn't forget this one. It's going to really help you when you're talking about the civil rights or social changes as a whole. Once LBJ is actually elected and has a term of his own, he's really able to branch out on his plan for this Great Society legislation, more so than just a few Kennedy bills. So he's really going to keep this ball rolling. Again, this term Great Society, it's a term you're really, really going to want to latch onto. It's really indicative of the larger social changes movement, similar to kind of the wide, expansive impacts of the New Deal under FDR. We are going to see expansion of health insurance, which is not just a more contemporary issue with things like Obamacare, but we see the expansion of Medicare and Medicaid for those at most risk for not having that sort of protection, the elderly and the poor. There is over $1 billion funneled into the education system, public and private schools. And even LBJ is going to take this Great Society even steps further with the civil rights movement, banning literacy tests, putting federal officials at these polls to help monitor and protect the rights of African Americans in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So, so, so important. This is kind of the pinnacle of this conquest for equal access to voting rights. There's been many questions about that throughout. Really, it's been a century since the Civil War ended, 100 years, and the very first time that protection has actually been given for the 15th Amendment. So it's been a very long, protracted struggle. If you've ever seen the movie Selma, great film on the civil rights movement, the March on Selma with Martin Luther King Jr., and really that movement that he leads in Selma culminates with the passing of this legislation from LBJ. Despite the fact that you're going to have rebellious southern states not willing to give in to this federal control and this change, you're going to have many different people in many different states leading an anti kind of desegregation movement and this fighting against it, whether it be smaller individuals, but also even governors as well, publicly opposing the federal government. This is the federal government really backing behind this change. It's a huge amount of change over time for this subject matter. LBJ is also going to extend his Great Society not just for civil rights, but also a focus on poverty. Poverty in the country was a big issue for LBJ. I'm really focusing, trying to change that. In 1964, when he is actually elected, there's 35 million people that were living below the poverty line in the United States. He creates the Office of Economic Opportunity to try to manage this, and he's going to oversee a lot of different changes. We see the creation of things like the Job Corps, Head Start for preschoolers, We see a lot of these things to try to continue that education. The Job Corps for high school dropouts, trying to give them more training and help to get into the field to make a living. And Head Start, the earlier you can teach children to read, the longer success they're going to have and increase literacy rates and opportunities for them in school. There's study after study done of that even today, where there's movement to make this a universal thing, which isn't necessarily the case in all communities across the country. The other thing is it's not just for young children, but even adults post high school, getting educational training, technical training opportunities, different ways of providing skills and careers for different people. And by the end of the decade, by the time you reach 1970, 10 million people were above the poverty line than when it had started. So before we had about 35 million people below the poverty line in 1964, right? And so in just 6 years, by 1970, 10 million people had been lifted up above that poverty line. So that's immense change for sure. When we're talking about this war on poverty, which is a big term that Johnson likes to use, there's so many different terms that we can look at, but really just understanding the bigger picture, what the goal is here, and how does he possibly do that. He has the Economic Opportunity Act in 1964, which is really kind of this umbrella or this shell which funding can be funneled into, and aid and can be used to actually help accomplish these goals. One way that this is also done is the Tax Reduction Act, so reducing taxes so that people can have more money to keep and spend, hopefully stimulating the economy and growth and sort of giving back to itself. Medical Care Act, so providing for health care for different people. We have Medicare, we care for the elderly. We have Medicaid, we provide aid for the poor. We provide aid for the needy, those that are on welfare. And even some targeting the kind of most impoverished regions in the United States. One called the Appalachian Regional Development Act. This one particular region, for example, has an average income, right, or average family income in this area is 23% lower than the national average, so significantly lower on average, which means there are plenty of people below that line. So aiming at these areas that are economically depressed. And again, this region is along the Appalachian Mountain ranges, right here through Pennsylvania, West Virginia, right, cutting in almost kind of the Tennessee Valley area. You can maybe think back to the Tennessee Valley Authority or the Tennessee Valley Act back from the New Deal, kind of providing aid to that area, providing electricity, very impoverished. So there are all these different ways that we can help to try to provide reform and change. It was focusing on the amount, right, especially that lived in poverty, the average person, right, per capita income, right. The average income from a family that lived in that region was 23% lower than the entire American average, right. And so that was the average of people there. That means there are people even further below that line, and that is the norm for that region. So really putting extra emphasis onto the area of greatest need to try to create the greatest amount of growth. Living conditions were tough. There were so many people that it made people. There were so many people struggling that people had to leave, and so there were kind of shells of towns that were left. So population was down, support was down, income was down. There was a lot of problems hitting those areas, and that's one region that LBJ actually targeted. We could also see the environmental change parts of the Great Society. The Clean Air Act, it's putting kind of emission standards for vehicles. The Wilderness Preservation Act set aside, again, more land for preservation. This could be a continuation of longer strands. We've seen this in previous time periods, like Teddy Roosevelt, and we have that debate on conservation movements as well between him and John Muir about should we conserve our natural resources or should we preserve our natural resources? But this is again just another example of this, of change, of not just helping, right, the impoverished areas, but also helping trying to fix the environment as well. We can see changes in education, which are going to be huge. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, it sent a lot of federal money towards these public schools, right? Trying to help enhance all these other areas, whether it be libraries for literacy or special education for those students in need. Money funneling to help support arts in schools, whether that be visual or performance arts, whatever type of art it may be. There's so many different areas, and really what I want you to understand at this point, you do not need to understand every single key vocab term. That is absolutely ridiculous. That's not a realistic goal for you, but do understand something important here, that it is so wide reaching. Medicare and Medicaid still exist. Those are probably one of the longest lasting factors from the Great Society that's actually created, but it's a huge, huge amount of success that's really added there. Education is expanded to more Americans, so giving them more opportunities for success. Environmental preservation movement continued. So there are a lot of changes there for sure. But right, the problem is this worth the cost? So how much money was spent on these changes? Now, if you just take a minute there, it looks like a big number, right? The first set, hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, trillions. $17 trillion were spent on the Great Society. And the other big piece, this big component, did it completely eradicate poverty? Did it completely solve things? You could do the same thing with the New Deal. Did it completely solve unemployment? So let's look at poverty rates, 1965. So a year into the term he gets right after he wins the election, 14%. By 2006, right, how much has changed all the way up to 2006, almost 40 years in the future? Only 12.5%. 2012, 6 years later, spiked back up, 16%. 2018, not that long ago, 12.3%. So it's not. Is it really that much of a change? Is it a little bit plateaued? Is it erratic? Do we have that much change? So really, did it accomplish its goals? And there's all these questions that you can point out if you want to go into deeper complexity. But there is a large, wide sweeping effect of this, just like the New Deal. Even though the New Deal in and of itself didn't completely solve or eradicate the problems in the Great Depression, this did not completely solve and eradicate the problems of the 1960s as well, but it made immense change and immense growth. So when we're talking about the Great Society, we can talk about it in the same way as the New Deal. When we're talking about it, think of it as just a large, wide-sweeping social reform, right? Or domestic. It doesn't have to be social, right? It's economic as well, political, you could argue, but we're talking about domestic reform. So what extent was it successful? So it could be, say, in the form of a DBQ or an LEQ prompt. Evaluate the extent to which the Great Society successfully changed life in the United States during this time period. So it can be successful in some areas, right? It could be successful in the area of civil rights. It could be successful in the area of extending the protections that the government can provide, but it could also be unsuccessful where it didn't really solve the long-term problems of poverty. It didn't really solve all of the long-term problems of discrimination. There's still a vast amount of inequality and hatred and animosity, but you could argue that there was some success for sure. We can also think about this discussion of effectiveness through the lens of scope, one, but also importance, significance. So it may not be what changed more, but what was more significant or needed. And comparing and contrasting the Great Society with the New Deal is one common way, because they're a similar era, but they have a massive amount of impact. So this was sort of the frame and scope of SAQ number 4 option for the 2019 exam, but this is just one way that we could see access to this information on the exam. This Great Society movement is so encompassing, it's so quick, it's like a tidal wave. Really, by 1965, 89 different laws or reforms had been implemented or passed. It's unprecedented. Really, when you're looking at it, and we can compare it to the New Deal, but it was easily the most comprehensive since, and you could argue even more comprehensive in the amount of speed and frosty in which it comes through. However, if you would say that this massive tidal wave of change, you would assume that everything gets better or that it would be seen as a much more successful light. The problem is people didn't really respond well to Johnson because it wasn't so much that these things changed or him as a person necessarily. The first year or two was great, but the problem is he inherits everything from JFK. The good, right? That success and that reputation, but also all the bad. Still remember, we had a lot of problems in Cuba. We had a lot of problems in Berlin, in Europe, but not to mention just dealing with all that and the Berlin Wall really being fully constructed and that division happening or Castro still being in power. But we still have that whole issue in Vietnam that Kennedy really started to escalate. And now LBJ is picking up the pieces. It's going to be the biggest stain on his reputation, on his administration. Really, what people remember him for, not for any of these great social and domestic reforms, but really just for the Vietnam War. So here we are. This is the main subject that Johnson is known for, LBJ is known for. His impact on the civil rights movement, economics, domestic reform, completely overshadowed. And the Vietnam War is often known as Johnson's War, and we're going to talk about why. Is that a fair title? Is it not? We'll see. Really, foreign policy wise, we're going to see the first little bit of continuity here. We're going to see this continuation of kind of JFK's policies into the Johnson administration. Hardline, strong foreign policy, that was kind of his stance. He supported a lot of different coups and overthrows, for example, one in Brazil, one in Panama, one in the DR. But we also see this continued escalation from the Eisenhower through the Kennedy administration towards Vietnam. And this quote, I think, really sums up all of the actions we're going to see and the thought process behind all the decision making. I'm not going to lose Vietnam. I'm not going to the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way China went. People have not forgotten about China falling to communism. It's still disturbing to them. Domino theory is still a prevalent thought. So Americans are really trying to find a way to solve this issue, fix what's going on. Problem is, he's going to find a lot of conflict with Congress. He's going to find a lot of conflict from media. He's going to find a lot of conflict from the young people at universities, these baby boomers that are now in college, the most educated group in American history. They've had the most money and leisure time, and they're going to be the most outspoken and revolutionary group yet. So there's going to be a lot of change brewing all at once. When we're talking about the Vietnam War, I really like to just kind of sum it up with two general things. Number one, to know about the Vietnam War, there is going to be two major factors. Number one, there's long and grueling. It's going to take a very long time. It's not a quick war. It's not necessarily successful. It's not an easy war. It's not just that it drags on. It drags on. It's difficult. There's many lives being lost, a lot of supplies. But the other big piece is there's going to be a massive loss of support from the people, not only in the United States, but also in South Vietnam. So there's multiple different layers to this story. You can look at the amount of people that have died in the war, number one, but also looking at how long it is, the longest American conflict, not counting you count the current war on terror or the war against terror in the Middle East going on today in the 2000s. But comparing anything else, absolutely the Vietnam War. When we're talking about the number of people killed in action, whether it's civilians or actual U.S. troops, soldiers, right? It's staggering. We see people in South Vietnam. This is a picture of a Buddhist monk protesting the leader of South Vietnam, Diem, in the capital city. People are willing to take extreme measures to really prove these points. He douses himself with gasoline, has himself lit on fire in form of protest. He would rather have this fate than to live under what he determines as being a suppressive regime of Diem. Not a really good look for the United States either to be associated with him. Also, what's going to happen is there's going to be the leaking of information. There's going to be massive amount of distrust. This is going to come later in the Nixon administration, but the United States is going to be dealing with so many different layers here. And once this information comes out, the reputation of the government is going to be tarnished, and there's going to be a sharp swing downward about the size, scope, power, and trust in the government. So we're going to see that movement coming forward. But you can also see this movie if you want to kind of this subject matter take hold with the Pentagon Papers in the 2017 movie The Post. It's a really good movie to get at that as well. So there's a lot of different layers to this discussion, to this story. You can also see protests at home, civil unrest. It's not just people fighting against the war, but questioning, like they did in past wars, about what should happen. People are now going to begin resisting federal directives like the draft. People literally encouraging others to commit felonies, burning draft papers, resisting reporting to these stations. And so there's going to be a massive amount of conflict. Imagine the parents of these people who are the 1950s, very obedient to authorities type of values. That's going to change as well. We also see this discussion of why should I fight, right? Especially if I'm not being taken care of. So there's going to be a lot of questions of the civil rights movement continuing to brew. A much more escalated, larger, widespread movement sentiment than, say, the Double V campaign of World War II. A lot of changes and continuity we can draw into the Vietnam War. There's a lot of paths kind of converging at this moment. Ultimately, people, this sign also a little bit more extreme, but Johnson is a war criminal. How people view the president, massive amount of distrust, vocal opposition. These people are not going quietly into the night. These people that are discontent with the government. It is vocal. It is in the streets. It's a massive, wide sweeping movement. When you're also talking about Vietnam, there's also the battlefront side. But when we're looking at the battles in an AP course, AP US history, it's not so much that these battles tell us about how the military path went. That's not really the concern or the scope of the AP course. But there are things that happen there that impact the home front. And when that happens, that's when we really bring in these military aspects. So we're going to be seeing a lot of the impact on the individual soldiers when they come back. The landscape, why is it so difficult in this war? Why are we having such a difficult time? And you could trace that sort of discussion all the way back to period 3, talking about the American Revolution. Why did the British have such a difficult time in squashing this rebellion? Why did the Americans have such a difficult time squashing the rebellion in Vietnam? Despite all of this military, technological advance and superiority, why are we still having this problem fighting in this impoverished nation? There's going to be a mass amount of death, the media recollection of what's going on. We have not only photography that's sitting back, but again, video, because televisions are in the homes of so many Americans. They can get this information, see what's happening so quickly. There's going to be a massive amount of bombings, questions of the ethics of this war and the morals of this war, and also the ethics and the moral of the federal government as well. It's going to lead to different types of techniques to try to squash this rebelling conflict that we're fighting, and it's going to make it very difficult to justify these actions as the war goes on, as civilian casualties continue to rise. You'll see the burning of homes and different types of campaigns, the destruction of the environment. And as this kind of war yearns on deeper and deeper into it, the morale or the desire to continue to fight continues to be questioned and further broke down, and eventually it's going to turn into an anti-war, anti-government campaign. Because of not only the actions of the federal government, but some individual soldiers as well. When information like this leaks to the public, it's going to be absolutely horrid and awful. Backing unconditionally, blindly, is not going to be good enough for the American people. And one major example of this is something called the My Lai Massacre. In 1968, this is kind of just a book definition of it. What happens is U.S. soldiers are sent into a particular region in Vietnam where not long before American soldiers had been attacked and killed. And so part of it could have been seen as a revenge mission, but we go into a village that allegedly had been containing communists, soldiers that we were trying to fight against. But there was not a single one there. Despite all this, we still had a army troop go in there. As that platoon went into this village, despite there not being a single person of fighting age, only women, children, elderly, they're all going to be brutally, brutally murdered. News of this is going to be leaked in the Pentagon Papers, where there was a covering up by the federal government, and the federal government is really going to cover up a lot of things like the numbers of the amount of people that are being killed and the state of the war, and we're going to be kind of pushing through this fight as kind of a body count number where we're killing more of them than they are killing of us. We use this to justify our actions. But when war atrocities like this, I think it's a really good term that you can bridge the war to societal impact. That when you get things like this that completely stain the reputation of the government, you really can't get that off. The cover up, the distrust in the government, and how not only the government, but also soldiers coming back from Vietnam are going to be treated and targeted after this war as the war goes on. This fighting in Vietnam is not just going to take an impact on the soldiers and civilians of Vietnam, but it's also going to take an impact on the environment and American soldiers as well. One problem is going to be we're trying to use all this different form of technology to combat the terrain, which is very, very thick jungle terrain. We don't have a lot of experience with it. And the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong are going to be heavily using different forms of guerrilla warfare tactics. So we're going to try to destroy a lot of the foliage in order to get through. We're going to use something called napalm, which is like a jelly that what's going to happen when it hits and explodes, it splatters everywhere and it's extremely flammable. It ignites to burn things off, but the problem is if it catches on people, that burning will continue. If it catches on soldiers as well, so if you get caught in kind of a napalm bombing, it's going to be no good. The effects of napalm are going to be destructive to the environment and to people, but there's going to be other things we're going to use instead of just bombing runs. We're going to try to use chemicals as well. There are so many of these different chemicals that are created to try to help solve different issues. Probably the most famous one is something called Agent Orange, which you see over here on the right, meant to destroy the foliage and everything. So you can walk through, you can have soldiers, it'll kill the foliage, but it won't kill the soldiers, allegedly. The issue is it does. It has terrible, terrible effects. There are some people still today that have many different medical effects from being doused with this Agent Orange, and some people have very, very severe cases. It would look like this, and it got its name from its extreme color that came from it, but as it would kind of rain down from the sky, trying to kill off, it's an herbicide trying to kill these plants that the soldiers can find and root out these communist forces hiding in the jungle. But this is just one very, very severe case that can cause massive reactions to the skin and burning and difficulties. It caused diseases and cancers to come from it. So there are so many different people that are affected in this war front. Absolutely. The protest movement is going to continue to escalate at home for various reasons. In this case, you have some peaceful protesters that they're going to be very gutsy. In this case, a student going up to a wall of soldiers and shoveling flowers down the barrel of their rifles. But we're going to have large groups of people formed around, usually on universities. Sometimes the National Guard is going to be called in to force them to disperse. And this crowd is not necessarily going to be a super peaceful crowd at all, but they're going to be fighting against the war in Vietnam. Get the hell out of Vietnam, and they're going to throw rocks and they're going to chant and they're going to be, of course, disrespectful from the point of view of these soldiers, these government officials. It's going to get very, very contentious as this time goes on. But when we're looking at the story politically, how does this whole thing change? How does it get so bad? There's one event that you really, really need to know. It's something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Super important. If there's one thing that you know about the Vietnam War, you must know this term. So what happens in the Gulf of Tonkin? So the Gulf of Tonkin is a body of water off the coast of Vietnam. The United States ship, right, USS Maddox, was fired at. We allegedly shot warning shots at North Vietnamese boats. They shot back and hit our boats, and this was, in our minds, a declaration of war. They're attacking United States ships. We're not just there supporting anymore. Now we're being attacked. Word and news of this gets back to the U.S. government, and very quickly in Congress, unanimously, really, it was passed. Right, unanimously means no opposition. Gulf of Tonkin resolution is passed. And what this piece of legislation does is beyond the importance of just fighting in the war. This is a large-scale political term. This is the pinnacle of government control in 1964. At the end of 1964, LBJ has the authority to, number one, defend Vietnam at any cost, and two, unlimited military intervention at LBJ's discretion. That means he does not need Congress's approval to send more troops. That means that he does not need Congress's approval to escalate the war in Vietnam. It's all at his discretion, and this is 100% legal. It circumvents the role of Congress. He is going to escalate it to extreme heights. Remember, he's more of that Kennedy style mindset, that flexible response, go for the knockout blow, hard line stances, and we're going to handle this issue. So this is going to allow the war in Vietnam to skyrocket. Know this term, know this term, know this term. When you're talking about the war in Vietnam, there are so many different resources to get a better scope than I can really provide to you. I'm also going to point you to a couple different resources. This is going to be a quick overview of the Vietnam War. But some other things that you can use to really tell the story of the Vietnam War, I highly, highly suggest going and checking out these two videos. It's part of what's called the Best Damn Vietnam lecture from Jocz Productions. They are so good. They're so in depth. I know he's visited and traveled to Vietnam, and he does really good videos on these topics. One, really the background to this war, if you want to get kind of the understanding of where everything is, I highly encourage you to do that. But especially if we're talking about topically inside the Johnson administration and why it's really called Johnson's War, check out that second video. So I really encourage you to take a look at these lecture series. They're really going to help you. But we're going to talk about it in kind of a broad scope view. So 1965, Johnson's elected. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution's already been implemented. He's into his own term, so he's here until the next election. So the next election would be 1968. Now, based on the 22nd Amendment, he can still run again in 1968. He served 1 year for Kennedy, so he hasn't fulfilled up half or even full term for Kennedy. He won one of his own, so he still has the right to run again and win if he wants to in 1968. But we're going to peel that back before we get to that discussion. 1965, the idea is that if we don't get involved, that the fall of Vietnam is imminent. It's going to happen. So LBJ is really, really pushing for this action. Again, this sort of information being fed to him is similar to the way that JFK was being fed information that there was a missile gap that he needed to conquer and solve. Ultimately, LBJ is going to initiate bombing runs in North Vietnam. He's going to be asking for more soldiers, over 50,000 being sent to Asia. He's going to ramp this up where there is more and more and more troops being sent over. Over 100,000 was the original plan in 1965, and then an additional 100,000 in 1966, funneling over troops. And on average, the average cost of human life was 500 a month. So 6,000 U.S. soldiers every single year were expected to die in this conflict. But instead of taking a full-scale invasion, we try to support South Vietnam rather than in full invasion of North Vietnam. That is not the plan. The plan is to protect South Vietnam and rid it of communist threats. It's going to be a bombing and trying to hurt the North Vietnamese. So it's a little bit of an in-between, sort of between, I think of like Ike and Truman in the Korean War of what they're going to do, how should they handle it. It's not a full-scale bombing, I'm going to threaten you with nuclear war like Eisenhower, but it's not just completely sitting back. It's a little bit of both in between there. Ultimately, the other reason that's it's going to make it is so difficult is not to mention there's massive expansion, increase in the amount of troops that are being sent over. But Johnson is never going to give these kind of big open speeches about how we were planning to win the war in Vietnam. So they were getting information that we're going to Vietnam, a country that most people have never heard of, all the way around the world. And also at the exact same time, we're not necessarily able to judge, us being the people, how successful this war is being. All we can send back, tangible items from the government, are kind of death tolls. And we're going to rack up a higher body count than they will just to try to prove and support that we are actually winning this war. When we get to 1968, 1968 is the absolute high point of the Vietnam War. And to put this in perspective, we have 500,000 troops in Vietnam trying to prevent it from falling to communism. That is a lot of soldiers being sent. We're using bombing techniques. We're using search and destroy tactics. We're trying to sift through villages and tactics to find it. And if we can't use it, we try to destroy all of this territory so that they can't use it again. But despite all of this, it's vastly ineffective. There's so many different things that make this so difficult. 1968 is definitely going to be this high point in the Vietnam War. You have so many forms of weaponry that's flowing into North Vietnam that we can't really stop unless we invade neighboring Cambodia and Laos, which would then create a whole nother slew of issues. So even though there is a supply line flowing into North Vietnam and even communist forces, their supplies being sent to communist forces in South Vietnam, but they're cutting through neighboring countries. Can we bomb these other countries? Is that fair? Is that not? They're getting support from the Soviet Union. They're getting support from the Chinese. So we are really fighting an uphill battle here against trying to prevent all of these things from happening. Meanwhile, there's so much support being given to the communist forces in North Vietnam and in the communist forces in South Vietnam. We try to bomb like crazy for a couple reasons. One, we're trying to destroy these supply lines. We're trying to kill these soldiers. But in the meantime, there's a lot of civilian targets that are going to be caught in the middle of this. That is also going to increase the backlash on the home front. And when you're talking about the amount of people that are dying and the support, there's going to be massive amount of protests. And you can notice on this chart the approval ratings, right? December of 1965, things are okay, but once we get into 1966, right? This is May 1966. Things become muddled. This isn't good. It's a very split approval rating, and it keeps going up and down, up and down, up and down. And once we hit this point, right, we're hit 67, things become a problem, and by 68, it's all over the place. They're not able to effectively judge. The people feel like the government is not transparent. The approval rating, right? Green is the approval, right? The white is the disapproval. All right, we're down here into the low mid 20s, low 30s. It's really inconsistent. None of it's very good. There's more disapproval than approval. A lot of protests, a lot of anti-government sentiment. It's not going to help fighting two wars at once. War against the Vietnamese, trying to stop communism, and really a war at home with the lack of. This war rages on, and this is one of the more iconic photos of Johnson. His years in office were very difficult. They did not go well, and the impact that it has on him is unbelievable. And I'm just going to include a couple quotes here, really just to give you inside the mind of President Johnson and what he's thinking. I knew from the start that I was bound to be crucified either way I moved. If I left the woman I really loved, the Great Society, in order to get involved in that bitch of a war on the other side of the world, then I would lose everything at home, all of my programs, right? But if I left the war and let the communists take over in South Vietnam, then it would be seen as a coward, and my nation would be seen as an appeaser. We would both find it impossible to accomplish anything for anybody, anywhere on the entire globe. So we felt no matter what he did, he would lose. If he stuck with the Great Society, which was his real passion, really what he wanted to do, then he would kind of have to abandon everything, which is really what happens. A lot of civil rights legislation is going to go by the wayside because of the focus on the Vietnam War. But if he just stayed on that domestic focus and left what happened in Vietnam to just be itself, and we lose that, then the fear is what else is going to expand, and that we can't help anyone around the world, and that the Soviet Union is really going to take control of this Cold War, and communism is continue to expand around the world. Vietnam had driven away my hopes to feed the hungry and shelter the homeless, and to provide education and the medical care to the browns and the blacks and the lame and the poor, to all of these different people who had already been subjugated to different levels of discrimination. And really, it's kind of this culmination that he has all of these great plans and great things, but all of this is going to be drowned out by the Vietnam War. So, including all of the immense social effects, a lot of it's going to occur in about 1964, 1965, and after that, you're going to see this real trickle down in the actual amount of changes able to be had and legislation that's able to be had because of the Vietnam War. All of the money and focus is going to be from there. But the difference between this, say something like World War II, the amount of public support is so different. When we're taking some just kind of conclusions of this bigger picture here, what's ultimately going to happen, is we can compare JFK and LBJ because they kind of get paired together, and rightfully so. Under JFK, there was a lot of consumer spending. It was a strong stance on the Cold War. There was a lot more social reforms at home, right, or attempts at all these things. He's not as successful, but the blueprint or the framework for all of this is going to be had. And as we transition into LBJ, there were many great successes at home. The domestic reform was immense when we're talking about civil rights and this implementation of the Great Society. However, Vietnam is going to really be the beginning of this counterculture movement that's going to hit stride by 1968, the escalation, the highest point in the Vietnam War. So we're seeing so much change. And when election rolls around in 1968, LBJ will refuse to run for re-election. He will not run again. So the Democratic Party is going to be in shambles. It's going to allow for a Republican to take office by the name of Richard Nixon. There's so much counterculture movement going on. There's a lot of change. So there's a lot of things going on. The last thing I'm going to do, right, we're pretty much done here. I'm just going to go through a quick review of a couple of things for you, a couple takeaways to see some bigger picture stuff after this, and then we'll shut this video off. Right? So things to think about is how are we doing in the Cold War so far? So if we're continuing this story, we're going to take a step back, right? So let's go back to Truman, 1945 to 1952. That's when he's in office. 1945, World War II had just ended. We see some issues with the splitting up of Germany and Berlin. We see the falling of China to communism. And we also see the Korean War. And we've been able to successfully contain in all of those areas. Now, Truman doesn't end the Korean War, but he does ultimately get his goal accomplished by the way that Eisenhower handles things. So speaking of Eisenhower, we go into the next presidency in the 50s from 53 to 60. We see the Korean War. He's really successful there, brokers an agreement. He gets involved in Vietnam, starts sending generals to help the French. There's not a massive amount going on in Vietnam during the 50s or much of our involvement. There's lots of resistance, a communist revolution movement led by Ho Chi Minh, but it hasn't really expanded. So he hasn't really had a lot of issues there. He hasn't had the Chinese kind of supporting the North Vietnamese as much in that realm, just like he got them to back off of North Korea. So gets the Chinese to stop expanding. There is a massive buildup of ICBMs and a nuclear arms race that's going on, but there's not a lot of conflicts. We get them out of Egypt and the Suez Canal, and we have the creation and really the implementation of the CIA at a higher level. So it really hasn't gotten that bad. America hasn't really had to do much, but the big fear is with Sputnik that we're falling behind. So the American fear is that we're really losing this battle. Then we get into the Kennedy years, 1961 to 1963. Kennedy is going to deal with a couple different issues. We see, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, but what happens in Berlin? Total flop, total failure. What's happening in Vietnam? Not going well either. What's happening in Cuba after the Bay of Pigs crisis? Not well. But how he handles the Cuban Missile Crisis that comes as a result is this really, really big upward swing, upward trend that really makes him have a very positive outlook from other people. We eventually do get a man on the moon in 1969. He really pushes for that. He doesn't see it. Johnson actually doesn't happen during his administration. It happens during the Nixon administration in 1969. But all this escalation is going to continue in Vietnam under Johnson, and that is going to be a total flop. Now, we're not really directly fighting, once again, still the Soviet Union like we saw maybe in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we are getting our butts kicked in Vietnam, number one, and number two, we are losing this war of support at home. So there are a lot of discussions and debates here going on. Then we get to Johnson, who takes over after Kennedy's death, wins a term of his own, and finishes in 1968. His big thing he's dealing with under the Cold War, he supports a lot of different initiatives with the CIA for sure. But the number one thing he's really known for is Vietnam. It's called Johnson's War for his escalation in Vietnam. He's never able to actually solve it, fix this problem, or get U.S. troops out of there. It only increases. He keeps on that policy from JFK. So if we're looking at this as a scope of things, we have Truman basing his thing off containment, keeping communism where it is. Eventually, in the Korean War, it becomes more of that the U.S. government is encouraging a little bit of action, but the number one route is containment. Then Eisenhower builds off of that and puts in kind of his philosophy of brinkmanship, of being willing to talk that big talk and big threats and not being too coy or shy to use those big threats. Then we get to JFK, continued in Johnson, this movement of flexible response, troops and subs and planes being ready to fight, military mobilization and having that available, but it does not go well. We may be winning some of these fights. We really do lose in Vietnam. We lose that fight for most intents and purposes when we're looking at long scopes of history, but we're also losing something much, much more important, and that's public support at home. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and drop a comment down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Good luck.